Albert Camus wrote about a man named Sisyphus. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, not metaphorically, literally. Every single day, for the rest of time, he pushes this boulder to the top. Every single time it rolls back, he walks back to the bottom, picks it up, starts again, forever. Now, most people hear this story and think that's punishment, that's suffering. That's the chords being unnecessarily theatrical about the whole thing. Camus heard this story and thought, that's us. Not some of us. Not the unlucky ones. All of us. Every generation, every civilization. Every movement that has ever gathered enough momentum to feel like it was finally, genuinely, permanently changing something, the boulder always comes back down. But here's the question I've been sitting with. Does it? Does the boulder really comes down? Because here's the thing about the boulder that the clean, nihilistic version of the story conveniently skips. We don't push one boulder, we push many. Racism, casteism, feminism, environmentalism, slavery, colonialism, poverty, authoritarianism. And here's what the honest version of history actually shows. Some of those boulders reached the top and stayed there. Slavery was abolished, not metaphorically, actually abolished, in law, in practice, across most of the world. That too within a historically remarkable window of time. People pushed the boulder for centuries. It reached the top. Colonialism ended, not cleanly, not completely, not without leaving wreckage that is still being sorted through, but the formal architecture of empire collapsed. Countries that were owned became countries again. That boulder moved. Women got the vote, not everywhere, not equally. But the direction changed. The boulder moved and kept moving. So, before I tell you that nothing ever changes, which would be the easier, cleaner, more dramatically satisfying argument, I want to acknowledge that some things actually did. The people who pushed those boulders were right to push them. And I think they deserve that acknowledgement before we complicate it. And now, the complication. Hegel, a German philosopher, considerably less readable than Camus, but considerably more accurate about how history actually moves. He had a concept called the dialectic: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Something exists, something pushes against it, the conflict produces something new. That new thing becomes the next thesis, which produces the next antithesis, and that produces the next synthesis. History doesn't go in circles. Hegel said it goes in spirals, which looks like progress from certain angles and feels exactly like the same hill from the inside. And here's what the spiral actually looks like in practice. Slavery was abolished, real victory. Boulder reached the top, and then, quietly, gradually, with considerably better branding, wage labor arrived. You are no longer owned, you are employed. The distinction is meaningful and also, depending on your specific employment contract and your specific Tuesday morning, occasionally theoretical. You have freedom. You also have a mortgage, a performance review, three different productivity apps your company requires you to use, and the specific psychological texture of a person who is technically free and functionally unavailable. Marx called this wage slavery. He wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. The boulder reached the top. A new boulder was already waiting on the other side. Colonialism ended as well. Real victory. The formal architecture of empire was dismantled country by country across the 20th century. The flags came down. The governors went home. And then, also quietly, also gradually, with considerably better lawyers, economic colonialism arrived. Trade sanctions, IMF conditions, structural adjustment programs that told newly independent countries exactly how to run their economies in exchange for the loan they needed because their economies had been systematically extracted for 2 centuries. Today, the most powerful country in the world doesn't need colonies. It has trade policy. It has dollar dependency. It has the ability to sanction nations into compliance without a single soldier crossing a single border, although they have a big army as well. So the mechanism changed. The relationship, that didn't change. The boulder reached the top of one hill, it was already rolling down another one. Marx, who had thought about most things and was wrong about enough of them to be interesting, said something that I keep returning to. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. Now, he borrowed this from Hegel. The point being, the second version of a problem is always a slightly absurd echo of the first one. Slavery as tragedy and corporate performance reviews as farce. Colonial governors as tragedy, IMF structural adjustment programs as farce. The farce is harder to fight than the tragedy because the tragedy is visible. It has a face. You know what you're pushing against. The farce is diffuse, it's systemic, it's in the terms and conditions you agreed to. It wears the aesthetic of progress while maintaining the architecture of the thing that progress supposedly replaced. And it's very difficult to start a revolution against something that technically gave you a choice. Which brings us to the modern version of the boulder. Something happens, something genuinely stupid, usually involving someone with power doing what people with power reliably do, which is act like the concept of consequences was invented for other people and not them. Within ours, there is outrage, legitimate, justified, completely reasonable outrage. The outrage finds its shape, a slogan, a symbol, a number that keeps going up. The Cockroach Janta Party last week, something else the week before, something else next week. Already being prepared by people who don't know it yet but will feel very strongly about it very soon. Different boulders, same hill, impressive consistency. The number here that goes up, it feels like momentum because in every other context, a number going up means something is working. We have been trained by decades of metrics to believe that a rising number is evidence of progress. Here, in this case, it is not evidence of progress. It is evidence that other people are also annoyed, which is validating, but not the same thing. There is a petition. There are memes, collectively, collaboratively, beautifully produced by people who have never met each other and will never meet each other but have somehow achieved in 45 minutes what most creative agencies charge 6 weeks and a retainer for. There is a genuine distributed, leaderless, creative industry that springs into existence around every major outrage and dissolves just as cleanly when the 72 hours are up. And there is a logo. And I want to briefly acknowledge the logo person specifically, the one who shows up within 6 hours of every major event with a finished, frankly, quite clean design. Nobody really knows who this person is, but they are the most consistently productive member of every movement in human history. And they deserve recognition even if the movement itself achieves nothing. Unfortunately, and I say this with genuine sympathy, AI is now doing their job in 40 seconds. The revolution will be generated. Prompt, logo for movement, urgent, something with a fist, make it feel grassroots. Enter, done. The last person in this entire ecosystem who was actually producing something tangible has been replaced by a text box. I find that poetic in a way I don't fully have words for. Marx might, he usually does. though he'd probably also find a way to make it about capital, which, fair enough, it is. Now, here is where I want to be careful because I have just described the calorie free version of pushing the boulder. The share, the follow, the signature, the 72 hours of collective energy that evaporates the moment something else happens. And I want to be honest that this is a warning, not a verdict. Because sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the 72 hours doesn't end. It becomes a week, then a month. Then people are at Jantar Mantar with real demands, and someone unexpected shows up who lends it weight it didn't have before. The movement finds its feet. The boulder keeps moving. This happens. It is happening right now. With movements, you can name yourself, and I don't even need to. The calorie free version is still a trap. The feeling of pushing without the work of pushing is still the most efficient way to exhaust genuine energy on something that produces nothing. But this warning is for the people who stop at the feeling, not for the people who are still pushing. And the difference between the two from the inside of the 72 hours is almost impossible to see, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. The French Revolution was 72 hours once. It was a petition once. It was a crowd of people who were very angry about bread prices and had decided that today was the day they were going to do something about it. And they won. And then what happened? The terror. 16,000 people killed in the name of liberty. And then came Napoleon, who took the revolution's energy, pointed it at Europe, and ran it into the ground over 15 years of war that killed somewhere between 3 and 6 million people. The number depends on which historian you ask and how much they feel like depressing you that day. Then came the restoration. The monarchy came back. The boulders stayed up for approximately 4 years before it found a new hill and rolled down that one. Here, the monster was real, and this monster was killed. What followed was, and I want to be precise here, not the absence of monster. It was a brief, chaotic, extremely violent audition process for the next monster, which was held under revolutionary banners and accompanied by a great deal of sincere idealism. Now, Bangladesh in 2024, students, genuinely brave, genuinely principled students, took to the streets against a government that had been running the country like a family business for 15 years. They won. Sheikh Hasina fled, the world watched and called it a generational uprising, and they were not wrong. But then, within months, targeted killings, minority communities attacked, institutions hollowed out. The interim government holding together with the energy of something that very much wants to hold together and is discovering that wanting is not the same thing as being able to. Nepal has had so many revolutions, it has essentially made it a lifestyle. Monarchy was abolished, Maoists came in the government, governments collapsing with the reliability of a seasonal event. The poverty is still there. The corruption found new addresses. What we do is that we unleash one monster to kill another and then stand in the rubble genuinely surprised that, oh, there are monsters. We dismiss one discomfort for a different discomfort, trading a known weight for an unknown one, and calling it liberation because for a moment, briefly between the old weight and the new one, there was air. And here is what I'd want anyone inside a movement that is actually working to understand. The synthesis. The thing your victory produces is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the next chapter, which will have its own problems. Problems shaped specifically by your solutions. Problems that wouldn't exist without your victory, which means your victory caused them, which is not a reason not to have the victory. It's a reason to be clear eyed about what comes after this. The French Revolution didn't produce liberty, it produced Napoleon. And then liberty, and then Napoleon again, and then eventually something that resembled liberty with considerably more paperwork. Bangladesh didn't produce stability. It produced a different kind of instability that at least had the dignity of being self inflicted rather than imported. The boulder reaching the top is not the destination, it's the starting point for the next push. This is Hegel's spiral, not circles, spirals. Each loop higher than the last, each loop still a loop. Progress is real. The loop is also real. Both things simultaneously true. Both things requiring your attention simultaneously. So, does anything ever change? Yes, slowly, expensively, incompletely, with significant unintended consequences and at least one Napoleon per revolution. The thing that changes is never quite the thing you were pushing against. It's adjacent to it. It's the synthesis of the conflict rather than the victory of one side. It arrives late, looking different from what anyone imagined, and immediately produces the next problem, which will take the next generation the same amount of effort to partially solve. That's the spiral. That's Hegel being right in the most inconvenient possible way. And here is my actual suspicion about the calorie free boulder industry we have built. It doesn't just fail to push the real boulder, it actively consumes the energy that would have pushed it. Every signature that substitutes for a conversation, every share that replaces a decision, every 72 hours of burning collective energy that evaporates into next 72 hours. That is real human momentum that went somewhere it couldn't build anything. The warning is not don't push. The warning is know the difference between pushing and the feeling of pushing. Because the feeling is free, the pushing costs something. And the thing it costs is exactly the thing you need to push with. And before I get to Camus again, I wrote a book. Actually, I wrote two books, and one of the books is in publishing process. And here's something nobody tells you about publishing in 2026. Earlier, it used to work the other way around. You wrote an exceptional book, the publisher made you a star, that was the deal. Now, the publisher looks at your social media following before they look at your manuscript. The algorithm decides whether your ideas are worth printing or not, which is, and I want to choose the right word here, exactly the kind of boulder we have been discussing for the last 15 minutes or I don't know, 20 minutes. The gatekeepers changed, the gate did not. So, if you have watched this far and found something here worth returning to, consider subscribing. Not for me, for the completely broken economics of modern publishing that have made a YouTube following a prerequisite for being taken seriously as a writer. Now, Sisyphus would have understood the irony of asking people to engage with a platform in order to critique the platforms. Well, he had have done it anyway. Coming back to Camus, he ended the myth of Sisyphus with one sentence. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I have been thinking about what that means in the context of spiral rather than the circle. If nothing ever changed, if the boulder always returned to exactly where it started, then his happiness would be the happiness of someone who has accepted futility. A kind of beautiful, tragic, French resignation. But if the boulder moves, even a centimeter, even to a different hill, even into a new problem shaped by the solution of the last one, then Sisyphus, his happiness is something else entirely. It's the happiness of someone who understands that pushing is the point. Not because the top of the hill is a destination, but because every push changes the terrain. Every boulder that moves leaves the hill slightly different from how it found it. The next person pushing starts from a different position than the last one. Slavery ended because someone pushed. Corporate slavery exists because someone stopped. Colonialism ended because someone pushed. Economic colonialism exists because someone assumed the pushing was done. The answer to does anything ever change is, I think it's not yes or no. It's only while someone is pushing. And the moment that someone confuses the feeling of pushing with the act of pushing, the boulder finds its way back, not to the bottom, to a new position on a new hill with a new name and considerably better branding. Camus said, "Imagine Sisyphus happy." I think Sisyphus is happy not because the boulder doesn't come down, but because he knows something the gods who condemned him didn't anticipate. Every time he walks back down that hill, the hill is a little different. The path is a little more worn. The next push starts from a slightly better position. He is not going in circles, he is going in spiral. Now, the calorie free version of this punishment would have been if the gods had given him a petition to sign instead of a boulder to push. He had have signed it, felt briefly righteous about it, and the boulder would still be at the bottom. But Sisyphus, he pushes, and somewhere on a hill he hasn't reached yet, there's a boulder that stays up. He doesn't know which one, and neither do we. But that's the only reason to keep pushing, and the only reason to be clear eyed, brutally, uncomfortably, inconveniently clear eyed about the difference between pushing and everything that merely looks like it.